I've got a story for you today. I'm going to come down one more step. I'm a bit closer. I've got a story for you today. Ethan, can you go to the next slide? I'm going to tell you a story about this man. And it's an old photo, but his name is Frank Wild. It's kind of a crazy name, isn't it? Frank Wild, not Frank Tame, Frank Wild. Frank Wild, don't play with it, please. Frank Wild had a hobby. Who has a hobby? Who has things they like to do? What do you like to do? Play sport. What do you like to do, Ethan? Have alone time. Okay. Well, anyway, Frank Wild had a hobby. He loved to explore. And he loved to explore parts of the world, but his favorite part to explore was Antarctica. Do you know what Antarctica is? It's right down the bottom of the world where it's all snowy and icy and cold. And he loved going to Antarctica to explore. That was his hobby. Go to the next slide. I want to share with you what my hobby is. This is my hobby. I collect Lego. And this is a lifeboat that I'll talk about in my story today, okay? But the lifeboat belongs to the big ship that you can see in the picture there. And the ship's name is called the Endurance. And the Endurance was a ship that went all the way to Antarctica to go exploring. Can you go to the next photo? And it was made of wood, but it was made of extra thick wood so that it could go through the ice and not get crushed by the ice. And it had anchors and sails, and it also had an engine. Next slide. And this is where the captain was. He would steer the ship with the wheel, and they had life preservers and things on the ship. Next one. And they had their lifeboats. They had all sorts of lifeboats that they had on the ship as well. Okay, so Frank Wild was actually the second in command. He was the second person in charge on the Endurance. The person that was really in charge of the whole ship was a man called Ernest Shackleton. And Ernest Shackleton really wanted to be the first person to cross over Antarctica from one side to the other. He'd already come a bit late to the party, and there'd been someone else that had been the first person to get to the South Pole. But he wanted to be the first person to get from one side of Antarctica to the other side. So he set off with 27 other people on this ship called the Endurance. And here's Ernest Shackleton here. Let me show you. So Ernest Shackleton, there's our little explorer here, and you can see he's holding a sextant. Do you know what a sextant is? It's a little device that they used to point it at the horizon, and they could work out, based on where the sun was, where they were, a bit like old-fashioned GPS. And then he took with him this person as well. Whoops. This person's name was called Frank Hurley. And Frank Hurley was a photographer. He was actually an Australian. Ernest Shackleton was an Australian, but Frank Hurley was an Australian. And he was a photographer, and he had this little old-fashioned camera here. I'll hold it up so the adults can see it. Old-fashioned camera on a tripod. And he was an early millennial. Do you know why? Because he figured that if he didn't get a picture of it, it didn't happen. So he made sure that wherever he went, he got a picture or a film of it or something. He was like an old-fashioned millennial, right? Anyway, he would go to extraordinary lengths. He would climb up on the yard arm of the ship, and he would hang off the side of the boat, and he would do all sorts of crazy acrobatics to try to get the best photos that he could. Anyway, Ernest Shackleton and his crew set off for Antarctica, and almost from the get-go, things went wrong. The ice was too thick. Next slide. The ice was too thick, and it closed in around the boat. And pretty soon they found themselves on the Endurance stuck by ice. And they couldn't go forward and they couldn't go back. And they tried lifting the sails and trying to catch the wind. And they tried revving the engine and trying to get up, trying to move forward on their boat. And they just couldn't get anywhere. They were completely stuck in the ice. And so Ernest Shackleton said to his men, "Well, men, I guess we're going to be stuck here for the winter. Luckily, we brought lots of food with us. Let's just hold out here and see if the weather shifts and the ice breaks up and we can move." So that's what they did. They got all their things off the boat and they set up camp to try to wait out the winter. And they were there a long time, months and months and months, waiting for the weather to change. And then one day, the ice squeezed the boat too much, and they heard cracking and crunking, and unfortunately the ship sank because the ice had crushed it and it fell down into the waters. And so at that point, Sir Ernest Shackleton said, "Right, we're not going to try to cross the Antarctic anymore. We're just going to survive. So they got their lifeboats, like this one here. They got their lifeboats, and they put their lifeboats into the water. And they all got in their lifeboats. Let me put Shackleton here. And Hurley can sit at the back. There we go. So they got in their lifeboats, and they set off. And they figured that they could make for an island nearby, which was called Elephant Island, which is kind of a funny name, Elephant Island. And so they set off in their lifeboats, and they made it all the way to Elephant Island. Have you got the next slide, Ethan? Oh, there we go. There's the picture of the boat getting all crushed by the ice. Next slide. They made it all the way to Elephant Island, and Elephant Island wasn't much of an island. It was a very small island, and all that was there was a beach with some rocks and snow, all covered in ice, and some cliffs. And so they set up camp, and they got two of their lifeboats, and they turned them upside down, and built some stones and packed some ice around, and made kind of a little hut so they could kind of crawl in underneath and have a place where they could be out of the wind, where it's a little bit warmer. And Shackleton said, well, men, I think the majority of you need to stay here. And he picked 5 people to go with him. And they took a lifeboat, very much like this one. They took one of the lifeboats, and they said, we're going to try to make it to South Georgia Island, which was another island, which was 800 miles away. And that's about 1,300 kilometers. And they set off on their lifeboat to try to get to South Georgia, where they knew there was a whaling station where they could find some help to come and rescue the men. So Shackleton and his men set off in the lifeboat, and they went for 2 weeks. Can you imagine being in a boat like this for 2 weeks on rough seas, some of the roughest seas in the world, trying to get to South Georgia? And he left behind Frank Wild. Do you remember Frank Wild, the picture of the man I showed you? So Frank Wild was in charge of the men back here on Elephant Island. And when Shackleton and his 5 other men in the lifeboat got to South Georgia, they realized they'd landed on the wrong side of the island. The whaling station was on the other side of South Georgia. And Shackleton said, oh, dear, well, you know what? The men are too weak and tired by this point. He said, why don't most of you stay here? I'll just take 2 men, and we'll walk over the island to the other side and get help. And so that's what they did. They had to climb up a mountain, and then they bobsledded down the other side and made it all the way to the whaling station. Anyway, you would think that after all of that, Shackleton would have said, phew, I'm safe now. I think I'll just have a rest. Do you think he did that? No, he didn't. Straight away, he said, I've got to go back, and I've got to rescue, first of all, I've got to go rescue the men on the other side of the island, and then I've got to go back to Elephant Island and pick up all the other men that are waiting there, because they're waiting on us. And so that's what he did. He first of all went and got the men on the other side of the island, and then he begged and borrowed and pleaded for a boat to go over to Elephant Island to try to rescue his other men. And do you know, he got a boat, and he sailed across, but the ice was too thick and the boat wasn't suitable, so they had to come back again. And so he tried to get another boat, and he found another boat to take him across, and they tried again, and he still couldn't make it. Do you know he tried 4 times to try to get to Elephant Island? And finally, on the 4th try, after 4 months, he managed to get to Elephant Island, where Frank Wild and his men were waiting. And he picked them up. Next picture, please. And you can see them there. There's the boat coming to pick them up from Elephant Island. But Frank Wild, or this whole time while Shackleton and his men were looking for help, Frank Wild was with his men. And you know that every morning they would wake up, and Frank Wild would say, roll up your beds, boys. Today, the boss may come back to pick us up. And he did that every single day for 4 months. So they would go to sleep, and then the next morning they'd wake up, and Frank Wild would say, all right, boys, roll up your bags. Today, the boss may come. Do you know there's a verse in the Bible that tells us that Jesus is back in heaven, and he's preparing a place for us. And he says, one day I'm going to come back and rescue you. So while we're here, sometimes we might feel a bit sad and a bit discouraged. Things are not really going our way, right? And we're stuck on our little island here while we're waiting for Jesus to come back and rescue us. We can remember that Jesus had said, I will come back and rescue us. And so every day we can wake up and we can say, let's be ready, because you know what? The Master may come back and rescue us today. And do you know that Shackleton saved every single person? Not a single person was lost. What an amazing story. Okay, you can go back and sit down.